September 2nd, 1898, the plains outside Omdurman, Sudan. A 23-year-old cavalry officer sits mounted on the far right of the line, watching 400 British lancers form up for what they believe will be a simple charge against a few hundred enemy fighters. His name is Winston Churchill. His right arm hangs uselessly at his side, the shoulder dislocated so many times that he cannot grip a cavalry sabre without risking it popping out of socket mid-swing. So, instead of the traditional sword, he holds something no other officer in the British Army carries into battle. A German semi-automatic pistol, the Mauser C96. The bugle sounds. 400 horses surge forward, and in the next frantic minutes, Churchill will fire again and again at enemies almost within touching distance. He will shoot one man at close range. Another, so near the pistol barrel, nearly strikes the body. When the smoke clears and the 21st Lancers count their dead, 21 men killed and 50 wounded, Churchill will reload his Mauser and write to his mother that the pistol saved his life. He called it a ripper. He was not exaggerating. But here is what Churchill could not have known as he holstered that smoking pistol on the sands of Sudan. The weapon that saved his life would go on to serve in more than 30 conflicts across 5 decades. It would become the only semi-automatic pistol ever adopted as standard issue by the most populous nation on earth. Mauser pistols like his would be among the weapons used in the execution of the last Tsar of Russia. And its distinctive silhouette would become so iconic that nearly a century later, a Hollywood prop designer would transform it into Han Solo's blaster for Star Wars. This is the story of the Mauser C96, the German pistol that a shoulder injury forced Winston Churchill to carry into battle, the weapon that proved semi-automatic firepower could decide life and death in seconds, and the gun that Allied soldiers would encounter across 3 continents, from the trenches of the Western Front to the jungles of the Pacific, never quite knowing whether to fear it or covet it. The problem facing young Winston Churchill in the summer of 1898 was simple to state and terrifying to contemplate. He was about to ride into combat with 400 cavalry officers who would all be swinging sabres, and he could not use a sabre without his shoulder giving out. The injury had happened 2 years earlier. On October 2nd, 1896, Churchill was disembarking at Sassoon Dock in Bombay Harbour. His boat lurched away from the stone steps just as he grabbed an iron ring to steady himself. The violent wrench tore the capsular attachments of his right shoulder joint. The pain was immediate, the consequences would last a lifetime. Churchill's shoulder became what physicians call chronically unstable. It dislocated while he slept. It dislocated when he reached for books on high shelves. It dislocated during polo matches so frequently that he devised a leather harness connecting his elbow to his waist just to keep playing. In his memoir, My Early Life, Churchill wrote that the injury would cripple him at polo, prevent him from ever playing tennis, and prove a grave embarrassment in moments of peril, violence, and effort. A cavalry officer who cannot swing a sword is a cavalry officer with a serious problem. The entire tactical doctrine of mounted charges depended on cold steel meeting enemy flesh at speed. Officers trained for years to deliver killing blows from horseback. The sabre was not merely a weapon but a symbol of the cavalry tradition stretching back centuries. When Churchill received orders to join the 21st Lancers in Sudan for the campaign against the Mahdist forces, he knew he needed a solution that would let him fight without relying on an arm that might betray him at the worst possible moment. He found it in a London gun shop. Before departing for Egypt, Churchill visited John Rigby and Company on Pall Mall. There he purchased at least 2 Mauser C96 semi-automatic pistols, with ammunition to match. Evidence suggests he acquired a 3rd Mauser later. The C96 was then the newest and most advanced handgun money could buy. It offered something no service revolver could match: 10 rapid shots without reloading. The standard British Army sidearm was the Webley revolver. 6 shots, heavy trigger pull, slow to reload because each cartridge had to be inserted individually. If Churchill had carried a Webley at Omdurman, he would have needed to reload mid-charge. With dervish warriors swarming around him at arm's length, fumbling with loose cartridges would have meant death. The Mauser offered a different calculation entirely. 10 rounds in an integral magazine, fed by a stripper clip that could reload the weapon in seconds. A muzzle velocity of 1400 feet per second, the highest of any commercially manufactured pistol cartridge in the world. Effective accuracy out to 200 meters when the wooden holster was attached as a shoulder stock. Churchill practiced with it obsessively during the long journey up the Nile, preparing for the moment when his life would depend on German engineering. That moment came on September 2nd. The 21st Lancers formed up believing they faced perhaps 150 to 200 dervish fighters visible on the plain ahead. They were catastrophically wrong. Approximately 2,000 to 2,500 enemy warriors lay concealed in a dry watercourse called a khor, invisible until the cavalry was committed to the charge. What should have been a quick skirmish became a desperate fight for survival. Churchill later described the collision in vivid detail. One dervish threw himself to the ground, preparing a hamstringing cut at his horse's legs, a technique designed to bring down the animal and leave the rider helpless. Churchill fired at close range. Another enemy appeared with raised sword. Churchill shot him so near that the pistol barrel nearly struck the man's body. A third warrior, already wounded by surrounding lancers, staggered toward Churchill with a spear raised. Churchill fired again. In those frantic minutes of mounted combat, Churchill expended his magazine and reloaded as soon as he had a moment to think. His brother Jack wrote to their mother afterward that Winston had sheathed his sword at once on the sound of the charge and gone into it with his Mauser pistol. After firing several shots, the dervish would not come near him. The numbers from that day tell the story of what could have been. The 21st Lancers suffered 22% casualties in 2 minutes, 21 killed, 50 wounded. They inflicted approximately 400 dervish dead. Churchill emerged without a scratch, his shoulder never dislocated, his pistol never jammed. The German weapon had done exactly what he needed it to do. Churchill himself understood the historical irony. Perhaps he wrote later, if in the charge of Omdurman I had been able to use a sword, instead of having to adopt a modern weapon, like a Mauser pistol, my story might not have got as far as the telling. The man who would lead Britain through its darkest hour in 1940 owed his survival to a German gun purchased because of a dislocated shoulder. The weapon that saved Winston Churchill began as a secret side project that the boss did not want. In late 1893, 3 brothers working in the experimental workshop of the Mauser factory at Obendorf am Neckar began designing a self-loading pistol. Fidel Fiedeli was the superintendent of the workshop. His brothers, Friedrich and Joseph, worked alongside him. They drew on earlier experiments with self-loading rifles, adapting the principles to a handheld weapon that could fire multiple shots without manual cycling. Paul Mauser himself initially rejected the concept. He saw no commercial future in semi-automatic pistols and ordered the brothers to focus on rifle development, which was where the real military contracts lay. But the Fiedel brothers continued their work in spare moments, convinced they were onto something revolutionary. By mid-1894, the prototype had progressed far enough that Mauser recognized its potential. He approved continued development and, despite contributing nothing to the design, filed the patent under his own name on December 11, 1895. The first functional prototype was completed and tested on March 15, 1895. Serial production began the following year. The designation C96 meant simply Construction 96, the year production commenced. From that point forward, the weapon would bear Paul Mauser's name rather than the Fiedeli brothers who actually created it. The Mauser C96 looked like nothing else ever produced. Its silhouette was instantly recognizable and deliberately strange. The integral box magazine sat forward of the trigger guard rather than inside the grip, giving the weapon a top-heavy appearance. The barrel was unusually long for a pistol at 140mm, and the grip itself was a round wooden cylinder that earned the weapon its most famous nickname, the Broomhandle. The entire weapon held together through precision engineering rather than fasteners. The barrel and upper receiver were machined from a single steel forging, requiring exceptional manufacturing capability. The parts fitted together so precisely that the design required remarkably few screws for such a complex mechanism. This was German manufacturing philosophy made tangible. Complexity in service of reliability. Every component machined to exact tolerances. No shortcuts. No compromises. The numbers that matter start with the ammunition. The 7.6 3x25mm Mauser cartridge was revolutionary for its time and remained exceptional for decades. At 1400 to 1450 feet per second, it was the highest velocity commercially manufactured pistol round in the world. It would hold that record for nearly 4 decades, until Smith & Wesson introduced the .357 Magnum in 1935. The energy at the muzzle approached 400 foot-pounds, giving the C96 penetration and range that no revolver could match. Magazine capacity was 10 rounds, fed from the top by a stripper clip. This was slower than a detachable magazine, but faster than loading individual cartridges into a revolver cylinder. The effective range extended to 200 meters when the wooden holster was attached to the grip as a shoulder stock, transforming the pistol into something approaching a light carbine. At that distance, a skilled shooter could hit man-sized targets consistently. Weight loaded was approximately 1.25 kilograms, or 2 3/4 pounds. Overall length was 312 millimeters. Barrel length was 140 millimeters, or 5.5 inches. The action used short recoil with a locked breech, cycling reliably even with the powerful cartridge. Rate of fire depended on the shooter, but trained operators could empty the 10-round magazine in under 5 seconds. The variants that emerged over 41 years of production tell their own story of market adaptation. The standard commercial model remained largely unchanged, but Mauser responded to customer demands with modifications for specific uses. The Bolo model, named for its Bolshevik purchasers, shortened the barrel to 99mm and reduced the grip frame to comply with post-war treaty restrictions. It became one of the most common post-war variants, favoured by buyers seeking a more compact weapon. The M1930 introduced a smaller, universal safety and the distinctive step barrel that distinguished late production weapons. The M7 12 Schnellfeuer added select fire capability and detachable magazines, transforming the pistol into a machine pistol capable of 900 rounds per minute. Less common variants emerged for specific contracts. A small number were produced in 9mm Mauser export, a longer cartridge than standard 9mm Parabellum. Ottoman Turkey ordered pistols with extended 20-round fixed magazines. Persia requested pistols with Farsi script markings. Each contract left its trace in the serial number records at Oberndorf, documenting a global customer base that stretched from South America to East Asia. German military authorities evaluated the C96 repeatedly and rejected it every time. In official trials against the Luger P08, the Mauser was found to be less sturdy and poorly balanced for one-handed shooting. The integral magazine was harder to reload under stress than the Luger's detachable box. The German army adopted the Luger in 1908. The C96 would have to find its market elsewhere. And find it did. Between 1896 and 1937, the Oberndorf factory produced approximately 1 million C96 pistols across dozens of variants. Spanish manufacturers, primarily Astra, added another 70,000 to 100,000 copies. Chinese arsenals produced unknown tens of thousands more of varying quality. The weapon that Germany's army rejected became one of the most widely distributed military pistols on Earth. When war came in 1914, German military planners discovered that theoretical preferences matter less than production capacity. The Luger P08 was the official sidearm. Deutsche Waffen- und Munitionsfabriken, the company building Lugers, could not keep pace with frontline demand. Every week brought requests for more pistols than the factories could produce. The German military turned to the weapon it had rejected. The Prussian contract of 1915 ordered 150,000 C96 pistols from the Mauser works. But there was a catch that complicated everything. The Luger fired 9mm Parabellum ammunition. The standard C96 fired 7.6 3mm Mauser. Supplying two different pistol calibers to frontline troops created a logistical nightmare that quartermaster officers dreaded. Mauser's solution was elegant in its simplicity. Build C96s chambered in 9mm. These 9mm Mausers needed to be distinguishable from the standard 7.63 models at a glance. Soldiers loading the wrong ammunition into their pistol could cause a catastrophic failure. The 9mm round operated at higher pressures than the 7.63. Putting 9mm into a 7.63 chamber would likely bulge the barrel or crack the receiver. Mauser's solution was visual and unmistakable. They burned a large numeral 9 into the grip panels and painted it red. These became known as Red 9 variants. Approximately 137,000 were delivered before the armistice in November 1918. Combined orders from Prussia, Württemberg, and Austria-Hungary totaled approximately 173,000 C96 pistols during the war. Austria-Hungary separately imported 50,000 commercial models during 1916 alone, desperate for any sidearms they could acquire. The weapon Germany had rejected became the weapon Germany and its allies desperately needed. German assault troops, the Sturmtruppen, valued the C96 for trench raids where conventional tactics no longer applied. Close quarters combat in the maze of trenches, tunnels, and bunkers favoured volume of fire over precision. 10 rounds of semi-automatic fire outperformed 6 rounds from a revolver when enemy soldiers appeared suddenly at arm's length around a corner. With the wooden stock attached, the C96 functioned as what contemporary observers called a substitute for a light carbine, offering accuracy at ranges beyond normal pistol fighting. But the weapon had limitations that became apparent in the conditions of trench warfare. The complex mechanisms suffered in muddy conditions that defined the Western Front. The exposed bolt collected dirt and debris that could cause malfunctions at the worst possible moment. Cleaning the weapon required partial disassembly that was impractical in combat conditions. Frontline infantry increasingly preferred purpose-built submachine guns like the Bergmann MP18 when these became available. The C96 saw heaviest use among rear echelon troops, artillerymen, aviators, vehicle crews, and officers who valued its prestige as much as its firepower. Mauser even developed a dedicated trench carbine prototype with 40-round magazines specifically for stormtrooper use. The concept made sense on paper. A pistol-caliber weapon with rifle capacity and stock attachment for close-quarters trench fighting. Only approximately 40 were built before the concept was abandoned in favour of true submachine guns. The submachine gun had arrived, and the pistol's days as a primary infantry weapon were numbered. The Ottoman Empire had been among the C96's earliest military customers, purchasing 1,000 pistols in 1897 for Sultan Abdul Hamid II's palace guards. These weapons saw actual combat after the Young Turk Revolution of 1908 released them from armoury storage. Ottoman officers and NCOs carried C96s at Gallipoli against British, Australian, and New Zealand forces. The weapon Churchill had used to kill dervishes was now being used against soldiers of his own empire. Italian forces encountered C96s in the hands of Austro-Hungarian troops along the Isonzo front. The rugged mountain terrain of the Alps favoured compact weapons that could be carried during difficult climbs. Austrian mountain troops valued the Broomhandle's combination of firepower and portability in terrain, where every gram of weight mattered. But the C96 had proven its worth across the Western Front, the Eastern Front, the Italian Front, the Middle Eastern theatre, and beyond. And its most extraordinary chapter was being written on the other side of the world. China made the Mauser C96, something it never was in Europe, a standard military sidearm issued to entire armies, the only nation in history to adopt the broomhandle as primary issue for its armed forces. The reasons were political as much as practical. During the warlord era of 1916 to 1928, rifles were difficult to obtain through official channels. European powers restricted exports to Chinese factions, fearing instability in the region. But pistols slipped through more easily. Nobody had thought to restrict pistols with the same vigour. This created an unexpected opportunity. The C96's carbine-like capability with shoulder stock attached made it an effective substitute for the weapons the warlords could not easily purchase. With the stock mounted, the broomhandle could engage targets at 100 to 200 meters with reasonable accuracy. It was not a rifle, but it was close enough for warlords who had no other options. Between 1919 and 1936, an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 Mauser C96 pistols were imported from Germany to China. The scale of these purchases dwarfed anything seen in Europe. Entire divisions were equipped with broomhandles as their primary sidearm. Chinese arsenals supplemented these imports with domestic production of varying quality. Hanyang Arsenal manufactured between 13,000 and 16,000 units. Taku Naval Dockyard produced approximately 4,500 of notably high quality that rivaled German originals. The Shanxi Arsenal created the most unusual variant of all, the Type 17, chambered in 45 ACP to share ammunition with Thompson submachine guns. Approximately 8,500 were built before, most were melted down after the communist victory in 1949. The Chinese called it the box cannon, in Mandarin, Hazy Pow. The name referenced the rectangular magazine and the wooden holster case that doubled as a shoulder stock. Chinese troops carried the box cannon through decades of conflict that seemed to have no end. The warlord era, the Northern Expedition, the Chinese Civil War, the Second Sino-Japanese War, the resumption of civil war after Japan's defeat. Both sides of China's ideological divide relied on the weapon with equal enthusiasm. Nationalist forces under Chiang Kai-shek carried German, made Mausers alongside Chinese copies. Communist forces under Mao Zedong did the same. General Zhu De, who would become Commander-in-Chief of the People's Liberation Army, carried a personalized C96 during the Nanchang Uprising of 1927. His pistol remains on display in Beijing's War Museum to this day, a relic of revolutionary violence preserved in glass. The C96 offered Chinese forces several advantages over Japanese alternatives they captured in battle. Magazine capacity of 10 to 20 rounds versus the Japanese Nambu's 8. A more powerful cartridge that outperformed Japanese pistol ammunition at range. The ability to convert to a makeshift submachine gun with shoulder stock and, in the case of the Schnellfeuer variant, fully automatic fire at 900 rounds per minute. Chinese soldiers facing Japanese aggression appreciated every advantage they could find. The weapon also acquired cultural significance in China beyond its military utility. Warlords posed for photographs with C96s prominently displayed, signalling power and modernity. Revolutionary leaders adopted the broomhandle as a symbol of armed resistance. The pistol appeared in Chinese opera and film as the weapon of choice for righteous avengers and patriotic fighters. Decades after production ceased, the box cannon remained embedded in Chinese popular culture as a symbol of the struggle for national survival. When Japanese forces invaded Manchuria in 1931 and expanded into China proper after 1937, they captured thousands of C96s from Chinese defenders. These weapons were redistributed to Japanese garrison forces, puppet government troops, and colonial police units. The flow of Mausers continued east, from Germany to China to Japanese occupation zones. Some of these captured weapons would later be recaptured by American forces in the Pacific, completing a journey of tens of thousands of miles. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. Now let us examine what happened when the weapon returned to European battlefields in 1939. By the time German forces invaded Poland in September 1939, the Mauser C96 was officially obsolete. Production had ended 2 years earlier. The weapon was nearly 50 years old, ancient by military standards. Germany was transitioning to the Walther P38 as its new service pistol, though Luger still filled holsters in huge numbers. The broomhandle should have been relegated to museums and collectors' cabinets. Instead, it went back to war. The numbers tell the story of institutional pragmatism overriding theoretical preferences once again. In 1942, 19,000 C96 pistols were issued to regular Wehrmacht units that needed sidearms and could not get enough Walthers or Lugers. The Luftwaffe purchased 7,800 commercial M1930 pistols from remaining Mauser stocks in 1940 for motorcycle dispatch riders and flak crews who needed compact firepower. Red 9 variants recycled from Weimar-era police forces saw renewed military use with second-line units and police rifle battalions on occupation duty across Europe. The weapon found its most dedicated users among specialized formations that valued firepower and intimidation over standardization. Waffen-SS units employed the Select Fire Schnellfeuer variant for close-quarters operations, where automatic fire could clear a room in seconds. Reconnaissance elements of the Totenkopf division carried them for actions behind enemy lines. Kriegsmarine naval infantry used them for boarding actions, where the confined spaces of ships made rifles impractical. The Brandenburg Division, Germany's Special Operations Unit, selected Schnellfeuers for covert missions, where maximum firepower in minimum size mattered more than ammunition standardization. The Schnellfeuer itself represented the C96's ultimate evolution. Designed by Carl Westinger and produced through the late 1930s, roughly 1932 to 1938, it featured select fire capability, allowing both semi-automatic and fully automatic operation. Detachable magazines holding 10 or 20 rounds replaced the original stripper clip loading. The cyclic rate approached 900 to 1,000 rounds per minute, emptying a 20-round magazine in just over a second of continuous fire. Approximately 98,000 were manufactured before production ceased. One German assessment noted that the Schnellfeuer was often used by the Waffen-SS in actions behind the front, mainly against resistance fighters and partisans. The weapon that had saved Winston Churchill at Omdurman was now being turned against European civilians resisting German occupation. History has a bitter sense of irony that spares nothing and no one. For the ordinary German soldier, the C96 was an inheritance from an earlier generation. Fathers and uncles had carried these pistols in the trenches of Verdun and the Somme. Now sons carried them across the steppes of Russia and the deserts of North Africa. The weapon connected two generations of German soldiers in two catastrophic wars. Many of the C96s issued in 1942 had serial numbers dating to 1916 or 1917. They had survived one world war to fight in another. The human cost of that continuity defies simple accounting. How many men died facing C96 fire between 1914 and 1945? How many survived because the weapon jammed at a critical moment or because its complex mechanism failed in mud or snow or sand? The pistol's service record spans millions of individual encounters, each one a life saved or ended by German engineering from the 1890s. German soldiers who carried the C96 in 1944 often knew nothing of the weapon's history. They did not know that Churchill had used one at Omdurman. They did not know that Bolshevik revolutionaries had executed the Tsar's family with them. They did not know that Chinese generals treasured them as symbols of power. They knew only that the Wehrmacht had issued them a strange-looking pistol with a wooden grip shaped like a broom handle, and that the ammunition supply was erratic, and that if they survived the war, they would have a story to tell about carrying their father's weapon into battle. On the other side of the lines, Allied soldiers who picked up abandoned C96s from German casualties had equally little knowledge of the weapon's extraordinary journey. They saw only an unusual trophy that would look impressive on a mantelpiece back home. The layers of history embedded in each pistol remained invisible to the men who held them. Soviet soldiers encountered the Mauser C96 as both enemy weapon and inherited equipment from a strange period of cooperation between former enemies. The Red Army had purchased approximately 30,000 Bolo Mausers during the 1920s, when Weimar Germany and Soviet Russia cooperated secretly to circumvent Versailles Treaty restrictions that limited both nations' militaries. German officers trained on Soviet soil, Soviet factories received German technical assistance, and Mauser pistols flowed east to arm the Red Army. The Bolo designation came from Bolshevik purchasers who placed the original orders. The variant featured a shortened 99mm barrel to comply with treaty restrictions on barrel length that attempted to limit the military utility of German weapons. The shorter barrel reduced muzzle velocity and accuracy at range, but made the weapon more compact for concealed carry. It comprised over 1/3 of all C96 production worldwide, testimony to the scale of Soviet purchases. Soviet commissars and secret police officers carried these compact Mausers throughout the Russian Civil War and the bloody purges that followed. The weapon became so associated with Bolshevik authority that Russian cinema adopted it as the visual shorthand for revolutionary violence. More significantly for the course of World War II, the Mauser cartridge itself shaped Soviet weapons development in ways that persisted for decades. The 7.6 2x25mm Tokarev round was derived directly from the 7.6 3x25mm Mauser cartridge. Soviet engineers took the German design and modified it, with different projectile dimensions and often hotter military loadings for submachine gun use. The ballistic performance was similar enough that captured German Mausers could fire Soviet ammunition with minimal issues, and Soviet weapons could chamber captured German rounds in emergencies. The Tokarev cartridge became standard for Soviet pistols and submachine guns throughout the Second World War and beyond. The legendary PP Shea 41 submachine gun, produced in quantities exceeding 6 million, fired ammunition descended from the Mauser C96's cartridge. Every burst from a PP Shea echoing across the Eastern Front was a distant echo of German engineering from 40 years earlier. The weapon the Red Army used to destroy Wehrmacht divisions owed its ammunition to a German pistol. Red Army soldiers captured C96s from German prisoners and casualties throughout the war. The pistol's distinctive appearance made it an attractive trophy, though less prestigious than the iconic Luger that every Soviet soldier seemed to want. Soviet troops who had grown up seeing the Broomhandle in revolutionary films now encountered the real thing on dead Germans in the rubble of Stalingrad and the forests of Kursk and the streets of Berlin. For American and British soldiers, the Mauser C96 represented something stranger than the familiar Luger or Walther they expected to capture. Its unusual silhouette, the forward magazine, the broomstick grip, made it look almost science-fictional compared to conventional handguns. Capturing one meant possessing something genuinely exotic that would impress everyone back home. The numbers on C96 captures by Allied forces are impossible to verify with any precision. Unlike rifles and machine guns, pistols were not systematically collected or documented by rear echelon units. Soldiers kept them as personal trophies, sent them home through military post when regulations allowed, or traded them among themselves for cigarettes or other valuables. Photographs from the European and Pacific theatres document American G is holding captured C96s with evident pride, but the total quantity remains unknown. What we know is that Allied soldiers encountered C96s across multiple continents in circumstances that would have seemed impossible to predict. In Europe, they captured German-issued weapons from Wehrmacht and Waffen-SS personnel during the advance from Normandy to Berlin. In the Pacific, they captured Chinese-made versions from Japanese troops on Okinawa. These weapons had travelled extraordinary paths, from German factories to Chinese arsenals to Japanese capture during the invasion of China to Pacific Island garrisons to American hands. Each transfer represented a story of violence and survival that the final owner would never know. The C96 occupied a peculiar position among German war trophies. The Luger P08 was the prestige prize, the weapon every American soldier wanted to bring home to hang above the fireplace. The Walther P38 was the standard German service pistol, common and functional but lacking romance. The C96 fell between categories, rarer than the Walther, less prestigious than the Luger, more unusual than either. Collectors today prize them, but soldiers in 1945 were not thinking about collector value. American Rifleman magazine summarized the contradiction well in later assessments. The Mauser C96 is nothing if not a collection of contradictions, ill-balanced, awkward, slow to reload, uncommonly ugly. Nonetheless, it was accurate, reliable, and effective. The weapon worked, it just worked differently than anything else. Soldiers who captured C96s often found them impractical to actually use in combat. The 7.6 3mm Mauser ammunition was not part of Allied supply chains. Once the original magazine was empty, finding replacement rounds required capturing more German stocks or hoarding what came with the weapon. Most C96s ended up as display pieces rather than combat tools, carried for prestige rather than practical use. European resistance movements used whatever weapons they could acquire through capture, theft, or airdrop. Yugoslav partisans fighting in the mountains, French Maquis sabotaging German supply lines, Polish Home Army fighters preparing for the Warsaw Uprising, all employed captured German pistols, including C96s. For these fighters, ammunition supply was a constant problem that limited what weapons they could actually use. Every round fired was a round that might be irreplaceable. The exotic German pistol was often more trouble than it was worth compared to common revolvers or Sten guns dropped by Allied aircraft. Jewish militias in Palestine possessed both standard C96s and Schnellfeuer variants during the 1948 War of Independence. These weapons had arrived through various channels, some purchased on black markets, some captured from British forces, some smuggled from European battlefields. The broomhandle that had served Ottoman palace guards, German stormtroopers, Chinese warlords, and Russian commissars now defended kibbutzim in the Negev desert against Arab armies. The Mauser C96's cultural impact extended far beyond its military service. Its unusual profile, the forward magazine, the elongated barrel, the cylindrical grip made it instantly recognizable and cinematically exotic in ways that conventional firearms never achieved. In an era when most handguns looked broadly similar, the broomhandle looked like a weapon from another world, which is exactly what it became. In 1977, property designer Roger Christian was searching for weapons to use in a low-budget science fiction film being shot at Elstree Studios outside London. The production had almost no money for custom props. The director, a young American named George Lucas, wanted his space opera to look used and real rather than shiny and fake. Christian scavenged British antique shops and military surplus dealers, looking for objects that could be modified into futuristic weapons. He found a Mauser C96 in a London antique shop, serial number 299415, manufactured sometime between 1915 and 1921, during the height of the Red 9 contract. Christian shortened the barrel, added a Hensoldt Wetzlar rifle scope to the top, and attached an MG-81 machine gun flash hider to the muzzle. The result was Han Solo's DL-44 blaster. The film was Star Wars. The Mauser became the most famous science fiction weapon in cinema history. George Lucas's production notes referred to the blaster as a kind of pistol from outer space, which is precisely what the modified C96 appeared to be. Something too strange for any Earth army, but perfect for a smuggler in a galaxy far, far away. In 2022, the original prop sold at auction for $1,057,500. Collectors have warned that fans are now altering increasingly rare original Mausers to create blaster replicas, destroying historical artifacts in pursuit of movie memorabilia. The weapon that saved Churchill at Omdurman is being converted into toys because of a film made 80 years later. The Federley brothers could never have imagined such a fate. Beyond Star Wars, the C96 accumulated a remarkable list of famous users and infamous uses that spans continents and ideologies. T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, carried a C96 during the Sinai and Palestine campaign, using German engineering to help defeat the Ottoman Empire. Mauser C96s were among the weapons used by the execution squad that killed Tsar Nicholas II and his family in July 1918, in that cellar in Yekaterinburg. The last emperor of Russia died in a chaotic fusillade from multiple weapons wielded by Bolshevik revolutionaries. Spanish Prime Minister Eduardo Dato was assassinated with a C96 in 1921. King Alexander I of Yugoslavia was shot with one in 1934. In Russia, the broomhandle became cinematic shorthand for Bolshevik commissars and revolutionary heroes. Decades of Soviet films established the visual association between the distinctive pistol and revolutionary authority. The weapon became part of Russian cultural memory, as recognizable as the hammer and sickle or the Red Star. In Ireland, the C96 earned the nickname Peter the Painter after a Latvian anarchist believed to carry one during the 1911 siege of Sydney Street in London. Irish Republicans used Mausers in the Easter Rising of 1916 and the Irish War of Independence that followed. The broomhandle's reputation for revolutionary violence transcended national boundaries and political ideologies. The Mauser C96 represented a transitional moment in firearms design that pointed toward the future without quite reaching it. It proved that semi-automatic pistols could be reliable enough for military service when lives depended on them. It demonstrated that high-velocity ammunition could provide range and penetration beyond any revolver. It showed that 10-round capacity could mean the difference between life and death in close combat. Yet the weapon was also an evolutionary dead end. Its integral magazine, loaded from the top by stripper clips, was made obsolete by detachable box magazines that could be swapped in seconds. Its complex mechanism required precise manufacturing tolerances that increased costs and reduced reliability compared to simpler designs. Its awkward balance made one-handed shooting difficult without extensive practice. John Browning's M1911 Colt, introduced in the same era, established the design template that most modern pistols still follow: detachable magazine in the grip, tilting barrel locked breech, simple manual of arms. The Browning approach won the argument. The Mauser approach disappeared from future development. Production statistics reveal the commercial reality behind the mythology: approximately 1 million C96s from Obendorf over 41 years, perhaps another 150,000 from Spanish and Chinese manufacturers combined. Compare this to the Colt 1911 and its derivatives, produced in quantities exceeding 3 million for American forces alone during the Second World War. The C96 was a successful weapon by any reasonable measure. It was not a dominant one. What the weapon lacked in mass production, it compensated for in historical reach. The list of conflicts featuring C96 use reads like a catalogue of 20th century violence: the Mahdist War, the Boer War, the Russo-Japanese War, the Mexican Revolution, the First World War, the Russian Civil War, the Chinese Warlord era, the Spanish Civil War, the Second Sino-Japanese War, the Second World War, the Chinese Civil War, the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, the Korean War, the First Indochina War, and conflicts beyond. Few weapons have served so many causes in so many places over so many decades. The broomhandle-armed British cavalry officers, German stormtroopers, Russian commissars, Chinese warlords, Zionist settlers, and Vietnamese guerrillas. It defended empires and destroyed them. It executed royalty and protected dictators. It saved the life of the man who would save Britain. September 2nd, 1898, the plains outside Omdurman. Churchill sits mounted with a German pistol in his hand, his badge shoulder strapped into position. He cannot know that the 200 visible enemy fighters conceal thousands more in the dry riverbed ahead. The bugle sounds. The charge begins. Minutes later, Churchill has fired repeatedly at enemies close enough to touch. He reloads as soon as he has a moment. Around him, 21 British soldiers lie dead, and 50 more are wounded. Churchill survives, his shoulder holds, his pistol functions. The German weapon does what he paid it to do. 60 years later, that same man will lead Britain through its darkest hour. He will stand in Parliament and promise to fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields, and in the streets. He will refuse to surrender when surrender seemed the only rational choice. And none of it would have happened if a cavalry officer's shoulder had not given out in Bombay Harbour, forcing him to adopt what he called a modern weapon like a Mauser pistol. Churchill's reflection captures the contingency of history itself. Perhaps, he wrote, if in the charge of Omdurman I had been able to use a sword, instead of having to adopt a modern weapon like a Mauser pistol, my story might not have got as far as the telling. The Mauser C96 was imperfect, complex, awkward, expensive, obsolete before it stopped being produced. It was also accurate, reliable, effective, and in those frantic minutes on a Sudanese plain, it proved that the future of combat belonged to semi-automatic firepower. Germany built the weapon, Britain's future Prime Minister proved it in battle, and across 5 decades and 30 conflicts, soldiers on every side discovered what Churchill learned at Omdurman. When your life depends on a pistol, 10 rounds are better than 6. The Mauser C96, the German pistol that saved Winston Churchill, the broomhandle that armed 3 continents, the weapon that appeared in both world wars, on both sides, in surprising numbers, and the gun that became Han Solo's blaster because its silhouette looked too strange to belong to any world we know. That 23-year-old cavalry officer on the plains of Omdurman could not have imagined any of this. He only knew that his shoulder was bad, that the enemy was close, and that the German pistol in his hand offered 10 chances to survive. He took all 10, and history changed because of it.